So we're going to pick up on the brochure today in Exodus chapter, we're going to be looking at some verses here, 1 to 7 and 10 to 17. I think this is in Exodus actually, chapter 3. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites have reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. First of all, you know who he's talking to, right? At that point, he's talking to Moses. Let's look at verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. This is one of the most important stories in the larger story that God tells. In fact, you will find throughout the New Testament and even throughout the Old Testament, what happens in this part of God's story has a huge impact, really even to the present day, on Israel, on the church, on everything that God was doing. Now you might remember that last week that Joseph, the kid with the multicolored coat, got thrown down a well, sold by his brothers into Egypt, became a slave, rose to become second in command of Pharaoh, saved his family from famine. And you might remember that at the end of that story, that Joseph used his power to give the Israelites the best part of the land of Goshen. And because they were shepherds and sheep herders and farmers of a sort, they began to prosper enormously. You know, anytime there's immigration in a country, there's always tension. There's tension throughout the world about immigration now. And so the kind of things that we think about in our present day world about immigration are the same things they thought in the ancient world. And only their solutions were quite harsh. And so the Egyptians didn't like the Israelite immigration and the fact that their population was growing, and they felt that they were going to be displaced by them, and so eventually they put them into slavery. And for the next 430 years from Joseph all the way until the deliverance, they ended up eventually progressing into slavery and being the slaves of the Egyptians. So here's the familiar part of the story. We talk about the lower story, the part that we see, and the upper story about what God is doing. The lower story is familiar, and that is life changes, doesn't it? Life is always changing. It's never the same, even for a short period of time. Life is always in flux, it's always in movement, it's always in motion. Life changes. And life change for the Israelites went from the favored people, right? You got your guy is the vice president. You're gonna, let's enjoy the fact that our guy's in charge. Well, but sooner or later somebody else gets in charge. And they fell out of favor and into slave. The second thing about the lower story is the strong oppress the weak. And so as you read through the scripture, you're going to see again and again people who have power use it against people who are weak. Is that any different than today? Doesn't it sound like the same story? And so you have that throughout the world. And the third thing about the lower story that's familiar here is the evil seems unstoppable. We in America don't have a really clear picture of slavery. It's so far in our past that most of us have never seen or experienced what slavery is like. There are a few people in this room that do understand it, but most of us do not. And slavery is a terrible evil, and if you were a slave, it would seem that it would be unstoppable. 400 years is a long time to be a slave, in slavery. These were generations, probably 10 generations of people that were born and raised into slavery. And yet, as that happens, there was a promise that God had given to Jacob, Israel, when he went in to live there, and that was that he would not stay in the land, that he would go back to where he came from. Now, we're not exactly sure when they should have got, maybe they should have gotten their shoes on after the famine was over and moved back. But none of us like to move from comfort, do we? If we get comfortable, we like to stay there. So I ask you this morning, how many of you were risk takers, and how many of you like to play it safe? Well, the truth of the matter is, many of us are risk takers at some point in our lives, but all of us eventually like to play it safe. It's just what we do. We take risk and then we come to comfort. And we're not easily dissuaded from comfort to take new risk. Everybody sort of finds an equilibrium of their risk taking. Well, in this slavery, the people are calling out to God. Actually, for 4 centuries, they're calling out to God. And we might ask the question, why did it take so long? I don't know, only to say that God does hear, does see, and God hears the pain of His people. And that's important both in Exodus and it's important in our lives when we think about it, because when a long time goes by, you might think God's not listening, because you're crying out to Him, but you're not getting the answer that you want. But we know that God hears the pain of His people, and He sees the pain of His people, and then God has a plan. And God's plan always chooses a man or a woman, even when they don't know it. And you're going to see throughout reading the story, over and over and over again, as you pick it up and you read it, there's a person in there. It's a man or a woman, somebody that God picks and uses. God uses people, because that's the raw material He has to work with. So God always picks somebody. God picks you, in a sense, to do something in your life that nobody else can do. But God's plan, that it's in place, a lot of times we don't know what His plan is. I get phone calls at the church, and when people call the church, they expect... they've come to expect that I'm African American. So when they go and they look on the website, it's always a big shock to them. Boniface, they think I'm an African. And I say, well, it's because I hang out with Africans and I've learned to love Africans, but they think I'm an African. So it's sort of funny that God has brought me to a place I never expected to be. But God has a plan even when we don't know what the plan is. And God had a plan for little Moses, even when his mother didn't know what the plan was, and all this terrible stuff was happening around her, and she hides him, puts him in a basket. He ends up being picked up by the daughter of Pharaoh, and that's the way God's plan is going to develop through Moses. You know, God's instruments are always imperfect, and so I'm on point 4 on the sheet, but we need to understand they're always imperfect. So if you're reading through the Bible, you're reading through the story, and you're looking for the perfect person that God is going to choose to do something, the only person who fits that category is Jesus. Everybody else is imperfect in some way. And Moses, you will see later on, has temper. He gets mad about things. He gets frustrated, and maybe he's a lot like you. Moses was imperfect. You know, think about Moses' childhood. I mean, this is like the stuff of like Jerry Springer. Because Moses gets abandoned, right, in a sense. He gets abandoned by his mother, put into a basket, where he could have died. Right? When they put him down in the Nile River, there's a lot of crocodiles and critters in the Nile River. He gets abandoned, put in a basket. Pharaoh's daughter draws him from the Nile, And then his little sister is there, and he gets the nursemaid they choose as his mother. So you want to talk about some like psychological things going on there? There's some really twisted kind of stuff going on. So Moses was he was a little scarred as a child. He was an orphan, he was a prince, he became a fleeing felon, right? He was a prince, and then he had a temper, and that temper caused him to murder somebody. So he was a murderer who becomes the deliverer. Interesting, right? How we write people off. He was the chivalrous benefactor. He was the one that beat the many people off at the well, and so he could, the daughters who'd come out to draw water from the well. That's a great story, right? What a good guy thing to do if you're trying to impress a girl, Beat the competition off and, draw water for them. So he does that, and he becomes the hand of God. But he is not perfect. Moses, in addition to not being perfect, and lots of people in God's story, takes an incredibly long time to figure out what it is he's supposed to do. Moses is 40 years old, approximately, when he flees after killing the Egyptian, flees into the wilderness. He is 80 years old before he comes back. You might remember I said to you, don't discount age in being used by God. If you think, I'm 40, I'm 50, I'm 60, I'm 70 years old, I can't be used by God, God uses people of all ages. He likes to use young people, he likes to use old people. He will use whoever is available and willing to be used. So Moses takes a long, but let's face it, Moses is a little slow on the take-up, right? And so God has to be creative. He uses this burning bush. Moses takes a long time to discover his destiny. And Moses discovers his destiny by being interrupted by God. He's comfortable. He's got a job. He's a shepherd. And he's interrupted by God. And God seems to like this creative approach when he is trying to get people's attention. I would not encourage you to go out looking for burning bushes if you're seeking to be called by God, because you're probably never going to see one. Except like the plant this time of year that starts to turn red, we call it burning bush. But other than that, God loves creativity. And so when God speaks to people, he likes to do it creatively. And so you'll see throughout the entire story of God, he always likes to do something new. He does something different. And this needs to be a little bit in your mind to realize the way God reveals and speaks to other people may not be exactly the way he speaks to you. So Moses was interrupted by God, his comfort, and God's creative approaches to call him. And then, of course, he's like everybody when God speaks to him. I remember years ago when I felt God speaking to my life. And whenever you sense God tugging you to do something, there are two things that happen. One, you're surprised that God's tugging, and the second thing is you begin to think of all the excuses of why you can't do something. And any time that there's a risk involved, you're going to think about why you shouldn't do it. That's human nature. And so Moses has all sorts of reasons why he shouldn't go back to Egypt. He's a fugitive, and he's not very good in front of people. How many of you would rather go to the dentist than speak in front of people? Just raise your hand. Okay, lots of people. You see, you're just like Moses. Moses, now we all see Moses with a big staff, but what we don't see him doing is when he's not ready to strike the sea, he's saying, no, I'm going to strike this water, and it's going to split in half. And the guy in the back is saying, what did he say? What did he say? But that's Moses. The idea that we get about Moses is that he was terrified, and he stumbled, and he probably looked down and said, when he spoke. And he wasn't good at it. But guess what? It didn't matter to God, because God says, okay, I'll bring somebody along to help you. Maybe that's where we kind of fail at our own idea. But we bring all these excuses up to God about why we can't do something. Now, God may not want you to be a public speaker. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that in God's story, God will use you in a way you don't expect to, and he will bring somebody alongside you to help you do what you need to do. Lots of somebodies, not just one person. Because he had Aaron, he had his sister Miriam, and he had Joshua and Caleb and all these great guys who helped him. So Moses begins to think of all these excuses like you do when God calls you. And what changes his mind is when God says, hey, really, this is why I boil the story down. God says, this isn't about who you are, it's about who I am. So, Moses is like really clever because all the Egyptian gods had names. You know, you got Horus and all of these Ra and all of these gods of frogs and gods of gnats, and that's what the plagues, by the way, we'll see have to do. But all these gods in Egypt have names, and Moses says, if I'm going to go there and ask the Pharaoh to let the people go out and have a holiday, who am I going to say sent me? And you know, God's answer is great here. And by the way, even today, when Jewish people read this part of the scripture, they don't say the name of God. I am is the unpronounceable name. Because really it says, I am the one who exists. You don't need to know my name because you really know who I am anyway. The choice to respond happens when a person moves from, who am I, as you're thinking about God, to who are you, God? And that's what God says. God says, I am. I'm the God who exists. When that happens in your life, when you get to that, when you're listing off your excuse about why you can't do something for God, why you can't serve Him, why you're too inadequate, and you know that God is tugging you to do something, somewhere along the line, the only way you will change and come to resolution in a way that's going to glorify God is when you ask the question, it's not about my faults, it's about who God is. And that's what happens here. Moses depends on I am. Now, we're going to see that Moses becomes the deliverer, right? We know the plagues happen, and but we need to know something about deliverance. The act of deliverance in any situation, whether it's in Moses' part of God's story or in Jesus delivering people from demonic possession later on, deliverance is messy. It is messy. And it's also miraculous, but we forget that it's messy. And so we have this tendency to believe that everything for the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt was like clean and surgical and antiseptic. It was a mess. It's a mess. I mean, you got to remember something, folks, about the plagues, okay? First of all, deliverance is long. I'm on point G, under 4. Deliverance is long, it's painful, and things initially often go from bad to worse. Did you ever figure that out? Did you ever try to do the wrong thing and things go worse? Get worse? Welcome to Moses' world. So Moses comes in, he goes up to Pharaoh with his brother, he says, my brother's going to speak. And Aaron says, Pharaoh, we'd like to take a holiday. We'd like to have some, some relief from making bricks for the weekend. Would you give us some calm time? Let us go out and have a picnic out in the wilderness. And Pharaoh goes berserk. And what happens is, he said, I'll give you calm time. Now try making bricks. Go out and get your own straw. And so things go from bad to worse. So if you have something in your life that's big, or you have a problem in your life you want to overcome, or you want to be delivered from some habit or something that's really oppressing your life, is enslaving your life, understand that the norm is things get worse before they get better. Do you ever try to resolve something with somebody and it gets worse before it gets better? I always find this when I go to fix my car. If I'm trying to deliver my car from a problem, I inevitably break something trying to get to the part I need to fix, okay? Things go from bad to worse. Deliverance also